Good morning, guys. Hope everybody's doing well this morning. We're going to start our second unit, which is Settling the West, or also known as Westward Expansion. So if you see either of those titles, they're talking about the same time period. So what we have is, this is that Wild Wild West. This is movies like Tombstone and Wyatt Earp and characters like Annie Oakley and Wild Bill Hickok. That's the time period that we're talking about. So this is the time period that Americans are moving westward. We've purchased the Louisiana Purchase, which has doubled the size of the United States. Remember, we have our philosophy of manifest destiny, believing that the United States should be able to expand from coast to coast. America is very young. We are moving westward as we begin the development of our nation. So we kind of want you to understand that there's actually a few things going on here. All right. So the Civil War has ended. People are trying to get away from the devastation of the Civil War to move westward. Okay. So when we talk about westward, we're talking about west of the Mississippi River. All right. So this new territory that you have has all of this land that's available. And so people are trying to start over after the devastation of the Civil War. We have a huge impact or a huge influence of immigrants, lots of immigrants coming into America at this time period, again, for economic opportunity. There's this idea that you can rebuild or restart your life in America. And so you have immigrants mainly from Europe that are just pouring in to the United States, but we also have immigration from other parts of the world as well, especially in the Asian world. We have a huge Chinese immigration coming in on the West Coast as we develop and as our railroads start to crisscross the country. All right, so there's a lot going on in this time period. So as people are moving westward to get a new start for this economic opportunity, you're also going to start seeing that in the East, our cities are getting more industrialized. So you're starting to see larger cities, larger populations. You're seeing more industrialization as we begin to move towards manufacturing and industries. So there's a huge amount of things that are happening in the United States during this time period. All right. So we're going to kind of break it down into some sections, but it's important that you see kind of the overview that all of this is going on basically at the same time. So they're kind of overlapping each other. All right. So we're going to start by talking about the settling of the West. And we want to talk about our miners and ranchers. So why are people moving westward? Well, one of the big draws to this new territory in the West is the deposits of gold, silver, and copper that are being discovered. So what we're starting to see is these precious minerals that are important to the development of our economy are being discovered in big deposits throughout the West. And so because you have gold and silver and copper that are needed for our growing industries in the East, you see this huge wave of settlers that begin to move and populate the West. Now, remember, these settlers are usually coming in to be able to strike it rich, right? So as soon as you would hear of a strike, there would be a stampede of prospectors to that site. Now, a prospector, that's someone who's going to come in who is trying to strike it rich. So these are your miners. Your prospectors are your miners. So they'll come in and they'll begin the mining process. Now, once you hear of a strike, more people will follow. So more and more people come in. It's called a boom. And then overnight, you'll start to see across the frontier, these outposts become boom towns. And so with boom towns, that just means that you have more people coming in. You see the development or the development of industry, well, not industry, but businesses. So you'll start to see saloons open up, hotels open up, churches are brought in. You'll see, for to take care of horses. So there's all kinds of things, all types of different businesses that follow the news of these strikes. And that means that towns are actually created. So you can see in the pictures that you have on the PowerPoint here on your lecture screen, on the left-hand side, that is a boom town. Now, what we're going to notice about the boom towns is most boom towns, their buildings are made out of wood. So if you look at the one on the right, you can see that those buildings are made out of wood. So you could see through photographs, or if you came into a town on the frontier, you could kind of see where they were in their stage of growth. Because if they had just tents and maybe a couple of wood buildings, they were extremely young. And so the strike had been recent and you were still having people moving in. The more buildings you begin to see, the creation of an actual main street or main road that's running through there, businesses built up on both sides of that main road. And the more buildings you saw, the longer they had been there. And so you started to see these buildings. Now, if you started to see buildings made out of brick, that particular town had been there for a while, and the people living there believed that it was something that was going to last. All right. So the picture that you see on your left-hand side, you can see the big building in the middle. That's made out of brick. You can see the big church in the background. Again, it's made out of brick. So that tells us that this particular town, this is an established town. It may have started as a boom town, but it's more established, right? The one that you see on your right, that is a boom town that went bust. So when the mines lost, when you could no longer find gold or silver or what other precious metal you were digging for, if you couldn't find it anymore, if it dried up, so to speak, then the mines would close. And then once the mine would close, the economy of that town collapses. So that means there's no work for people. So the people that live in that little boom town, they're going to now move. They're going to move to the next boom town. And so they're going to kind of follow these strikes that they see. They follow the miners, basically. All right. And so once you have the bust, people literally walk away from those towns. They literally load up their belongings on their wagons and they pull away and just they leave the town. And so this is what we call an economic cycle of boom and bust. And this economic cycle of boom and bust means that we can go from boom town to ghost town very quickly. It all relies on the amount of precious metal coming out of that mine, right? So you have to keep in mind that that's what's happening with our miners and these boom and busts that's happening. Now, we're used to boom and bust. We live in a city that's based on oil, and because we are dealing with petroleum production, we understand that our economy is based on that. So we try to diversify, but we're still based in petroleum. So that means if there's a boom, our city will grow. We'll see an influx of people. We'll see an influx of workers. You'll see new businesses, new restaurants, things like that. Now, as soon as you have the bust where everything drops in price, we start laying off workers, then people leave. They go to other parts of the country that have jobs that are no longer available in the Midland, Odessa area, right? So we understand this cycle of boom and bust just because our economy is really similar to what was happening in these boom and bust towns going on, or boom towns that were happening in the West, okay? All right. Now, when you talk about our miners, the big event that really draws attention to the West and brings hundreds of thousands of people into the Western frontier is the Klondike Gold Rush that takes place in 1896. So basically, you have this gold nugget that's found near Canada's Klondike River, near Alaska. And within months, you had over 100,000 gold seekers. These are the miners and the prospectors that are setting out for this Yukon region in Alaska. About 30,000 of them actually completed that trip. So that tells you that a lot of them got stopped on the way. They either settled down somewhere. They found a mining area before they got to the Yukon. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons that they didn't show up there after starting out heading towards Alaska and the Yukon. All right, so about 30,000 of them completed the trip. But then you start to see these other discoveries in Alaska, in the Rocky Mountains, in the Black Hills of North Dakota. We start to see more and more precious metals, especially gold, that's being discovered. And so you can see, hopefully you can see in the picture here, if you look at this, the one in the lower right hand, this is a miner, all right? This is a tough, tough job. This is not easy. You don't just walk out in the river and pick up a big giant gold nugget. That's what they wish, and that's some of the stories that were being told in the East that drew people westward. But this is a hard, hard life. All right. So this is something you're going to have to move around. You're going to do some backbreaking work. A lot of your prospectors were men. You didn't see many women doing this during that time period. This was something that a lot of, especially single men, would do because you were more nomadic. In other words, you're moving from place to place. And the work was really, really difficult. And it was dangerous because if you did discover something, you had to worry about robbers and bandits and things like that that would try to take your claim. So this was a tough, tough life that people chose to do. But it's something that helped in the development of our westward expansion because the more Americans that were moving westward, it meant that those lands were going to eventually become settled. If you have a territory and you don't allow settlement in that territory, chances are you're going to lose that territory. Somebody else is going to settle it if you don't. During this time period, during the 1800s, right? So the American government loves the fact that they're seeing more and more Americans moving westward because that means that they're going to start to see some settlement because these towns are being established around these sites. Some of them are going to be very successful. And so that's what the government's really looking for. So that Klondike Gold Rush is really what draws people, a huge amount of people, to the West and kind of starts this process of settling. So you can see in the photographs that we have here, these are prospectors here at the top. Again, you can see it's pretty back-breaking work. This is the way that they would travel. They put all of their supplies on a mule or a horse and would move from site to site, trying to find their gold or their silver to be able to strike it rich. Right now, honestly, very few of them are going to actually strike it rich. Some of them are going to find gold or precious metal that allows them to make a living, but very few of them are going to be millionaires from it. But the few that strike it rich and become extremely wealthy because of a strike, those stories are the stories that are being told over and over and over again in the East, in newspapers, that type of thing. And it just brings this great amount of excitement to this idea of having an adventure traveling westward. Right now, it is dangerous, but people tended to ignore those dangers because of the excitement that went around. Oh, I could strike it rich. I could make this gold, and I can find this gold, and I could be wealthy for the rest of my life. And so that drew a lot of people. Okay, the photograph that you see down here in the right hand side, this would be a normal boom town or a western town that you would see. So you'd have the main street right down the road, right down the middle, and then you have your businesses that develop on either side of that street. So you can see you have a hotel that's there, you have a mercantile, which is basically a general store where you can buy different products. There'll be a saloon usually. Usually, the longer the town is there, then you'll probably end up seeing a church. In this particular picture, you can't see that. But you're going to see towns like Tombstone that'll develop. If you've never seen the movie Tombstone, I would suggest that you watch it. It's exciting. It's a little violent. There's some foul language, so you might want to make sure that your parents are okay with you watching something like that. It's from the 1990s, but it is so well made, and you can see the background. If you look at some of their scenes, you get to see some of the development of towns as they come into in the movie. As they come into Tombstone, it is a boom town. It's a town that's becoming more established, and so you can kind of see what it looks like. Right over on the left-hand side, this is what we call a stagecoach. This is how people traveled. So you traveled a few ways. You could walk, you could ride your horse, you could pull a wagon. Okay, so you'd have a team of horses that you would ride in a wagon. a covered wagon or a basic wagon. And then the one that you see in your screen is what we call a stagecoach. A stagecoach is where you pay for a ticket to be able to ride on the stagecoach, and the stagecoach would take you from town to town. And so this is able to take you to towns that the railroads don't get to, right? So the railroads we're going to talk a lot about railroads. The railroads are moving westward as well, but they've got to lay track before they can get their trains to certain areas. So a lot of people would have to use stagecoaches to be able to move from one town to the other. So if you were just traveling, you lived in one town, but you needed to go visit a family member in another town, and there was no train available, then the stagecoach might be a way for you to do that. Okay. All right, so let's look at, we've got our miners that are kind of opening the door to the west. We know that the trains are moving westward. We have more and more development, towns being developed, but we're also going to see a huge change in areas in the middle portion of our country, like that's going to eventually be Texas. What we're going to see is, remember, the Civil War has just ended. So in 1865, the Civil War ends. Because of the Civil War, we're going to see that people are trying to rebuild. So they're looking westward. What can I do to kind of rebuild and start my life over? How do I make a living now that the war's over? And remember, the war absolutely devastated the economy of the South. And so because of that, many Southerners, freed slaves, those that were looking for a new start, they had lost everything, were looking for a new start, began to move westward, right? And so they're looking for a way to make a living. Many of them are farmers, and so they're moving towards that Great Plains region. One of the things that's happened because of the Civil War is there's a meat shortage in the East. So our eastern cities, like Philadelphia, New York, those areas on the East Coast, those big cities that we have, there's a shortage there of meat because the cattle had been slaughtered during the Civil War to be able to feed the militaries and the soldiers. And so the meat that was available was extremely expensive. And so your average person wasn't able to afford it. It's just too expensive. So many of the people that began to move westward began thinking about cattle ranching and developing cattle ranching there in the Great Plains to be able to sell meat in the East. Well, the problem is that when you brought Eastern cattle to the Great Plains, they didn't survive, right? So a lot of people are like, oh, cattle ranching won't work in the Great Plains. It's not practical. There's not enough water. The cattle can't survive. The prairie grasses are too tough. And so it's too hard, and you won't be able to make a living cattle ranching in the Great Plains. But here's the big but. In Texas, there was a breed of cattle that was running wild and had basically been running wild for about 2 centuries. This is what we call the Texas Longhorn, right? So you can see the 2 pictures there of different types of longhorns that still exist in the state of Texas. By 1865, remember, that's the year the war ends, the Civil War ends, there were as many as 5 million Texas Longhorns that were roaming across Texas. Now, there's a couple of reasons that you have so many of these Longhorns roaming free. One is the predators there were not extreme, so they were able to reproduce fairly easily. And also, there weren't a lot of people there. People's the main enemy of wildlife, to be honest. Okay, so they didn't have a lot of people there. And because the Civil War, the people that were living in Texas, they actually moved eastward because it's the only time in American history that we have an eastward movement in our population. And so they went east to be able to participate in the Civil War, or to move east because their husbands or brothers or fathers had entered into the war, and being out on the homestead was too dangerous, so they would move eastward to be able to have like a larger town or city that they would feel more protected in. And so these longhorns don't have real natural predators. There's no humans around. And so they're able to populate at a large rate. And so we're going to see there's an estimated about 5 million of them in Texas by 1865. Okay. So this is perfect timing. You have the shortage of meat in the east. You have people looking for economic opportunity moving westward. And they have this huge population of Texas longhorn roaming freely across the Great Plains. So things are pretty good. Now, like we said, before the Civil War, there's no incentive to round up the longhorns. Nobody needs them. We have cattle in the east and in the north that are being bred for slaughter. So there's really no need to even look or think about the longhorns that you have in Texas, in that Great Plains region before the Civil War. But like we said, during the Civil War, now we've slaughtered this huge number of cattle to feed the military. The prices of beef have skyrocketed in the East. And by the 1860s, and yes, even during the Civil War, in the 1860s, the railroads were beginning to reach the Great Plains. Remember, the American government, even during the Civil War, is still thinking ahead about expansion. We've got to get people out into that Western territory, because remember, we've bought the Louisiana Purchase. We've doubled the size of America. We have gold discovered in California. We have gold discovered in Alaska. So we have to get people westward, or somebody else is going to do it. And we don't want another country coming in, because remember, we've declared ourselves independent. We've said that these are our borders. And if we don't take care of it, if we don't put people out there, another country will come in and try to colonize. So the government is trying to push these railroads westward, and they're giving them all kinds of incentives to do it, right? So by the 1860s, railroads had reached the Great Plains region, right? So they're still building, but they're actually in the middle portion of America, what we call the Great Plains, right? That Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas region. Now, our ranchers realized that if they rounded up the longhorns and drove them up north to the railroads that had been established in Kansas, they could sell for a huge profit, because they could ship them eastward, right? So you're going to see lots of cattle being rounded up all through Texas, and you can see on the map some of the different trails, like the Chisholm Trail, that's going to take the cattle northward to Kansas. Most of them ended up in Abilene, Kansas. And so that's where we saw a lot of the cattle loaded up onto the trains. And then once they were on the trains, they would ship them to places like Chicago. Chicago has a huge meat packing industry. That's where the slaughterhouses were. And so you could ship your cattle there. They would be slaughtered, and then you could sell them to the larger cities from those slaughterhouses. And so that's what the Kansas became extremely important to the cattle industry, because you could get to a railroad. Now remember, what we're talking about is the railroads are coming eastward. They're coming eastward through the Great Plains, but mostly through, like the Kansas area, that territory there. We will eventually see trains or tracks come down into Oklahoma, into Texas. But in the early 60s, 1860s, what we're talking about is most of your trains are going to come through here. So this is where the railroad's developing first. And then from there, they'll come into this region, right? So the issue for your ranchers is, how do we get all of these cattle that are roaming through Texas? How do I get them up here to Abilene, Kansas, onto a train and shipped eastward to places like Chicago, right? So this is where the cattle drives are going to start, right? So we're going to have cowboys between 1867 and 1871. Cowboys are going to drive over 1 million head of cattle up trails like the Chisholm Trail, all the way up to Kansas, to be able to get them on trains and shipped eastward. Right now, a cattle trail or cattle drive is extremely dangerous. But they were able to drive them hundreds of miles to be able to get them onto the railroads, onto the trains. Okay. So this is kind of what a cattle drive would look like, right? So this is just a drawing of what one should look like. If you go out into a place like some of our larger ranches here in Texas or places like Wyoming, where you still have large cattle ranches, you'll still see this type of drive. It's not necessarily a drive; it's more of a roundup now. But there's a drive where you are moving them from one place to another. All right. So, in a normal cattle drive that you would see in the Western frontier, your trail boss is this guy right here. He's at the very front of the herd, and he's the guy that's in charge. So, you have to answer to him. If you're a cowboy, a wrangler, you have to answer to him because he's the person in charge of the drive. It usually he's either the owner or he is the right hand man of the owner of the herd. And so somebody has gone out and herded all the cattle together, and now we're going to drive them or push them to the railroads, right? And so you have your trail boss here. You have your swing cowboys. Okay, your points are usually second in command there. You have your swing and your flanks because you want your cowboys to basically surround your herd. All right. So remember, sometimes your herd can be thousands of head of cattle. So these cowboys don't necessarily see what's going on the other side of that herd because the herd can be that large. All right. You have the drags. If you're the drag, it usually means that you're one of the younger cowboys or you're new to this particular organization because nobody wants to really be the drag because all of the dirt and everything that's kicked up by the cattle is something that you have to walk through. And the drag is not the best position to be. You also have your wranglers. Your wrangler is the one that is going to pull off the herd, and he will be the one that either chases cattle that have gotten away from the main herd. He's the one that keeps the horses. So you have extra horses in case something happens to someone's horse. You do have a small herd of horses, and sometimes the wrangler would be in charge of making sure that the horses stayed together with the herd. So your wrangler could be somebody that actually leaves the herd chasing cattle that have gotten away from the herd. And sometimes they would be away from the actual drive, the cattle drive, for a few days, chasing down those that had gotten away. So that was kind of a dangerous job within a dangerous job. And then, of course, right here we have our chuck wagon. This is a picture of what your chuck wagon would look like here in the left hand corner. Your chuck wagon is where you get your food. Okay, so chuck is it was a name that was used to describe food, and so you would have a cook. That was his job for the drive. Your cook was in charge of the chuck wagon. Usually, the chuck wagon tried to stay ahead of the cattle so that all the dirt and everything didn't get into the wagon, but still close enough to be protected by the cowboys that were around. And so they would set up camp and they would feed them. Now they're not talking, you don't eat beef every day. You don't have steaks every night because you need every single one of those cattle to make it to the railroad. Because if they don't make it to market, you lose money, right? And so you need every single one of them to make it. And obviously that's not going to happen. You have some that have to be put down because they break a leg. You have some that die or are attacked by a predator. So there's all kinds of ways that you could lose some of your cattle. So you definitely don't want your cowboys eating them in the process of the drive, right? So it's you're talking about cornmeal, beans, stews, those types of things that they would be able to cook for the cowboys. Okay. Now this right here, this is a modern picture. Even though it's black and white, it's still modern. You can tell by the type of cattle that you have. This is talking more about the cattle drive itself was more with the longhorns. These are not longhorns. It's a different type of breed of cattle that you can see here, but you can still see that the cowboy is watching over them. You had to watch over them 24/7. So there were cowboys that had to watch the herd at night. You didn't want them to stampede. Remember, anything could make them stampede. Lightning, a storm, coyotes, wolves. You could just a loud sound could startle your herd and make them run. So once you startle one of them and it takes off, then it's an effect that hits the whole herd and they'll start to stampede. So your cowboys would move around the herd. They would sing, play harmonicas, those types of things to keep them calm, so they wouldn't have the stampede. You didn't want a stampede. If a stampede happened, then that would mean that you would lose a lot of your cattle and you would spend tons of time having to round them up again. Okay. All right, so we have these huge cattle drives that are happening. Now, some of the cattle went straight to the slaughterhouses, but many were sold to ranchers because the ranchers started to figure out that eventually once you continue to round up all these cattle, eventually the supply of those longhorns is going to dwindle and you're going to end up not having any more to round up. Remember, they were free. You could, if you were out on the free range, on the open range, and you could round them up, you could take them to market, right? So the longhorns were free. So the cattle ranchers, they started thinking about these ideas of how do I actually build my own herd? Because eventually those free longhorns that are roaming out there out in the open, I'm not going to have access to them eventually. So I have to build up my own herd. And so that's what you started seeing the ranchers trying to do. At the same time, you also had sheep herders that were moving into the Great Plains. Now, the sheep herders and the farmers, they don't like each other because the sheep herders are moving their flocks onto the open range. Now, when we say open range, we're talking about the fact that you have an open area and your herd, whatever it is, sheep or cattle, they can openly graze in that area. You don't have to pay anybody. You don't have to own it. It's open and it's free. And so you could allow your animals to graze there. Now, the cattle ranchers didn't really like the sheep herders because they believed that the sheep would eat the grass to the point that they eat it down to the roots and then the grass dies and then it can't grow back and now you don't have that grass available for your cattle the next season. Now that's not true, but that's what they believed was going to happen, right? And so the sheep herders and the cattle ranchers literally fought each other over different open areas or open range to be able to graze their stocks. So what's going to happen is we're going to start to see range wars break out over these competing groups. So these groups are going to start literally fighting each other. And when we talk about fighting, we're talking about guns and, the destruction of somebody else's herd, whatever it took to get that group or that person and their herd away from yours. And so these became pretty bloody affairs throughout the Great Plains, these range wars that take place. If you like Westerns at all, a good one is Open Range. It's a really good movie, and it talks about this fight that you have over having someone he has a herd of cattle that he's driving through a certain area, and he stops there so his cattle can graze, and it turns into this big war between him and those that are living there that don't want his cattle to be able to use that open range. But it is called Open Range. So, but if you're interested in those types of movies or anything, that might be a good one to kind of show you what we're talking about. We'll talk about the range wars. Now, the invention that changes the West and basically stops the cattle drives is barbed wire. Now, barbed wire, I'm sure you've heard of. If you haven't heard of it, you've seen it. All right. So you can see in both of these pictures here, you can see the fencing. This is barbed wire, right? So, and so this invention changes everything for the Great Plains. So what we're going to start seeing are farmers first are going to start using this barbed wire. Then your sheep herders are going to start using barbed wire. And what they're going to start doing is fencing off hundreds of square miles of acreage. And remember, this is open. So if you can get there and you can claim it, it's yours, right? So the ranchers started to realize that by their cattle drives were getting interrupted with this barbed wire. So what's happening is they're tearing down fences to be able to get their cattle up to Kansas and on a train or on the railroads to get them to market. And so, again, this is another point of intensity between those that are putting these fences up and those that are still trying to maintain the open range and allow for these cattle drives to take place. So eventually what happens is things change. The railroads start to come down into Oklahoma, down into Texas, so they're closer. You don't have to have the big long cattle drives. Ranchers figure out that they can do the same thing with barbed wire. They can fence off certain acres and they can keep their competitors off that land. And they can keep their animals closer to the sources of food and water. So they don't have to chase them down. They know exactly where they're located. And they know the approximate amount of cattle that they have. So they know when something's happening, whether somebody's stealing, whether they're wandering off, or they're getting off of the area that they have marked off for them with barbed wire. So your ranchers are going to start using the barbed wire, and they're going to keep their competitors off, and they're going to keep their animals close to the resources that they need to keep them safe and healthy, because you need to get them to your market. And so the big long cattle drives are done. All right. So barbed wire ends the cattle drives. And so the days of the open range are over. Now what we'll start to see, this is the real cattle ranching industry, right? So it has its heyday with the cattle drives and the excitement and the adventure of moving those cattle. And now with barbed wire, everything starts to settle back down, because now you have people settling. They're literally putting fences up, and they're living in those areas, and they have something that's claimed. And that's where their herds are going to be. All right. So they'll start building their homes. They'll have their ranches around, or their homes, and then their ranches around them. They're raising their cattle. And so everything is now fenced in. So barbed wire basically destroys the cattle drives, but it creates the ranching industry, which is good for Texas because that's a big part of our economy even today. And so even though the open range is over, the cattle drives are over, you don't really see the cowboys anymore. The cowboys are now replaced by ranch hands. You can still call them cowboys, and they still do today, but they're ranch hands today, because the cowboy was more of that cattle drive individual, and the ranch hand that now lives on those ranches and works the cattle, right? And we'll also see an end to the end of the use of the longhorn for the major beef source in America. New breeds are going to replace the longhorn. You can tell in the pictures there, those are obviously not longhorns. These are the type of cattle that we use today for our ranching industry. So much different than the longhorn. Now, the longhorn's still here. You don't see them roaming free anymore, unfortunately. We've decimated their herds, just kind of similar to what we did with the buffalo. And so now what we're going to see is kind of a difference. Even though the longhorn's still here, there's lots of people that have longhorns that still raise longhorns. They're beautiful, amazing animals, and they're still really tough animals that deal with our environment very well. So they're very, very interesting animals if you're interested in them. The longhorn, the history of the longhorn is interesting. Okay. All right. So let's look at our farmers in the Great Plains. All right. So we have our miners that have come in, the boom and bust towns that have grown. So we have our boom towns that are developing into bigger towns and cities, and we have our ghost towns where people have just left the remnants of those old towns behind. We have the cattle ranchers that have come in. We have barbed wire that's established, which the farmers and your ranchers and your sheep herders are all going to be using this new invention called barbed wire. Now, what we're going to see is the government, like we said, the government this entire time has supported this idea of moving westward. Now, the railroads are going to provide easier access to the Great Plains. So remember, we talked about how do I get from one place to another in the 1800s? Well, I walk, I ride horseback, or I'm in a wagon. And so the railroads are now going to offer something different. The railroad companies are going to sell some of the land that they have along their rail lines pretty cheap in order to invite people or get people to this region of the country. All right. So what's going to happen is the government comes in and says, okay, we want to support the laying down of railroad track and we want to support the railroads moving westward. So we're going to give you all of these land tracts. Okay, so literally the government gives them land tracts and in some instances sells land to the railroad companies extremely cheap. Now, once the railroad goes in and lays down their track and begins to build their railway, now what happens is they have extra land. So they're going to sell that land cheap to try to get people to move to those areas, because what they want to do is you want to build towns around these railroads. And so you would have a train depot, and then a town would build around that train depot. And so what's amazing about this, guys, is you live in a city that this is the reason our city exists. You had a little town, you had a little depot that was set up along the railroad. The railroad was going from El Paso to Fort Worth or Dallas. And so this was kind of a midway point. You had this mid-stopping point between El Paso and Fort Worth. And so a depot was set up midway. So this city that we call Midland today was once called Midway. And so it was called Midway. And then when a post office was opened here, the name was changed to Midland. So we're the land midway between Fort Worth and El Paso. And so our city starts as a train depot. And then our city or our town will build around that railroad. And then now once you start to see the establishment of a town, now you have industries, the ranching industry, the farmers move in, people start building homes. And from there, from your town, you have a city that grows, right? So we are the product of exactly what we're talking about in this time period, from this time period. So the westward expansion, we are the product of that. Our city is the product of it, right? So you can see in the advertisement here, it said millions of acres available, Iowa and Nebraska lands, right, for sale on 10 years credit. So they're selling them as cheap as they can. They're trying to get people to buy tickets, get on the trains, go that far out, get land out there and begin to develop that land, right? So they're enticing people out to the west, right? So in 1862, one of the things that the government's going to do to help, right? Remember, the government's already poured into the railroad industry. So they're already supporting the industry. They're giving them tax breaks, cheap land, all that type of thing. Now what they're going to do is help get people out there. So how do we get people out there? Well, you give them some incentive, something that they want. Well, what do they want? They want land. They want land to be able to build on because they want to build their ranches or their homesteads or their farms. So in 1862, remember, that's in the midst of the Civil War. Okay, so that tells you that the government's already doing this, even though we're in the midst of the Civil War. In 1862, the government passes what's called the Homestead Act. You have to know the Homestead Act, guys. It's extremely, extremely important, all right? But the Homestead Act, all it is it's going to, the government says, okay, we'll give you a tract of public land because it's owned by the U.S. government. We'll give you a tract of public land, then you can settle for a $10 filing fee. So you give the government $10, they're going to give you a tract of land. That tract can be anywhere up to 160 acres. So you can say, I want 160 acres. And they say you have a $10 fee. Remember, $10 in 1862 is a lot of money. So they're going to give them a $10 fee. and then you claim up to your 60 acres. Now, here's the catch. You claim that for your $10 fee, but you cannot receive the title to that land until you have lived on that land for 5 years. So if you're living on a stretch of land for 5 years, chances are you've developed that land. You've built structures on it. You've built fences. You're either farming, you're ranching, you're doing something productive on that land. And if you're being productive there, other people around you are, and there's probably a town that has developed there. So the idea is you stay there for 5 years, you develop it, and then once you've been there for 5 years, after that 5 years, then they're going to give you the title to that land. And that land belongs to you now. It's no longer government land. Right? Now, this is extremely difficult lifestyle. So we're talking about living out in the Great Plains. There's not a lot of trees. You have some very, very harsh weather. Just think about our weather here. Think how hot it's been lately. And so you're living out on the Great Plains. There's no air conditioning, guys. There's no fans. There's no electricity. There's no running water. And you have to be able to live and develop something on your acreage that you have homesteaded. And so you can see in the pictures on the left there, this is a hard life. This is not easy. Notice the housing that they have. Their houses are made of adobe brick because that's what's available, right? So they make their own bricks. So you make it out of, the grasses and the water and the dirt that's there in the Great Plains. So you make your adobe brick and then you build your homes from that. A lot of times their homes had dirt floors. You can tell on this one here, it's almost a dugout where it's built into. You had these, some of them that were actually built into the hill itself, and the roof was the hill of that they were dug into. But that was to try to help keep things cooler inside and warmer in the winter, and that was one way that they tried to do that. So it's a pretty harsh lifestyle. There is the issue of extreme weather. You have the issue of Native American attacks, because remember, this is open land, and so the Native Americans are still living there, and they don't want settlers there. They don't want to see somebody building a homestead, and so they would attack to try to send a message that they didn't want them there and see if they could get them to move away. That did not happen. Americans continued to move into that area, even with the Native American attacks that happened, and even with the horrific stories that came back to the east about those attacks. Americans still moved westward, and the expansion continued. Right, so this lifestyle is pretty difficult, and a lot of people didn't make it. Right, so those that were able to make it were pretty strong individuals or pretty strong families to be able to do it, right? And this is another reason, guys, that we had large families during this time period, because you would have a large family because you needed people to help you work your land. And they needed their children to help them. And so their children they worked from the time that they were capable of working. From a very young age, they had things that they had to do on their homesteads to make sure the homestead could work. Okay. All right, we're going to stop right there just for a few minutes, and then I will do a part 2 to be able to finish things off. Okay. So we'll stop right there with the homesteaders and the Homestead Act, and then we'll move into the next section. All right. Thanks, guys.